Summary of Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. In his 1950 essay Discourse on Colonialism, thinker and politician Aimé Césaire makes a strong accusation against the so-called European, or Western, civilization that rules the world today. Césaire says that this civilization is indefensible and must be overthrown by a popular movement of the working classes around the world. Europe can't be defended because of its past. From the 15th to the 20th centuries, Western European governments took over more and more of the world by force to gain power and money. During this time, they killed many native people and forced others to work for them on 4 different countries. So, when he talks from his home in Martinique, a French Caribbean colony, after World War II, Césaire can't help but see how hypocritical it is for Western Europe and the United States to act like they are saving the world. They are proud of themselves for stopping Nazi Germany and its supporters from killing people and expanding their empires, even though they still have empires of their own and kill everyone they rule over. In the first part of his essay, Césaire shows how Europe's stated moral values and its deeds throughout history are in direct conflict with each other. Europeans think that colonization brought freedom, justice, and civilization to the world, but this is a convenient lie that helped legitimize Europe's hateful solutions to problems that Europe made up. There is nothing noble about forcing people to become Christians or taking their art and putting it in museums in the West. Instead, the idea of European civilization was an excuse for Europe to use the labor and resources of the rest of the world in a brutal way. In the next part, Césaire says that Europe's civilized barbarism was terrible not only for the lives and well-being of people who were not European but also for Europe's own moral culture. In particular, the European ruling class, or bourgeoisie, became morally corrupt because it had to make up lies like civilization to excuse its cruel policies. This made it unable to see the humanity of non-white people. Césaire says that the terrible violence of the Holocaust is not an exception in European history. Instead, it is the end of European history. Most European governments tried to grow by killing people, just like the Nazis did, and bourgeois thinkers in Europe, even those who called themselves humanists, fought hard for the same white supremacist ideas that drove Hitler's policies. Césaire points out that the French conquerors enjoyed raping and killing non-white people, which is another example of how colonialism dehumanizes even the most civilized man. Colonization equals thingification, he famously says, meaning that it makes non-white people into inhuman objects in the eyes of colonizers, who then lose their own humanity by committing and justifying atrocities. Even though Europeans said they were bringing civilization to the world, Césaire points out that the world was already full of complicated, advanced, democratic civilizations that Europe destroyed in the name of civilizing. In his third section, Césaire continues this line of thought and points out that colonial violence is still going on. For example, the French just finished killing tens of thousands of innocent people in response to the Malagasy uprising in Madagascar. And even after World War II, well-known French intellectuals still defend white supremacy. To deal with this unfair world, we need to build a new society that uses the productive power of modern times in a democratic way to make sure that everyone has access to the freedom and human rights that European and American elites keep for themselves. In the next 2 parts of his essay, Césaire directly calls out journalists and academics whose writings make them just as responsible for the brutal violence of colonization as the sadistic governors and greedy bankers who planned it. Even though colonial-era scholars, especially anthropologists, say they are looking for scientific truths, they end up being watchdogs of colonialism because they spend their days making up the lies that Europeans tell themselves to justify what they do abroad. In other words, they made up the myth of European civilization based on the self-serving idea that only white people can have real science knowledge. Césaire looks at the geographer Pierre Guru, who said that non-European people were not capable of science and civilization because they lived in tropical climates, and the missionary Reverend Temples, who made up a theory called the Bantu Philosophy that made it sound like the people of the Congo wanted to be killed and enslaved by Belgians. The psychoanalyst Dominique Octave Mannoni said that colonialism in Madagascar was a natural result of the psychological differences between Europeans, who needed to get ahead by conquering others, and Africans, who have a dependency complex, like being in charge, and are guilty of collective madness when they rebel in the name of national independence. And finally, there is the anthropologist Roger Caillois, who says freely that he doesn't think non-white people can do science or ethnography, even though, as Césaire points out, Egyptians invented mathematics and Arab philosophers invented rationalism. All of these arguments are obviously wrong. They don't try to show that racism is true. Instead, they use racism as one of their basic premises and use that to defend European rule. In the last part of his essay, Césaire goes back to his call for a worldwide change. He says that, just like Rome fell because it tried to do too much, Western Europe is hitting a breaking point where its own excesses threaten to bring it down. As of 1950, the people Europe colonized want to be free and dream of a more fair future. And even though the United States seems likely to continue the bad things about colonialism through its economic dominance and capitalist orthodoxy, it is still possible for Latin American, African, and Asian countries to create a classless society that would give them the sovereignty, independence, freedom, and plenty that the West lied to them about for centuries.
About the author. Aimé Césaire was born to parents from the working class on the French settlement of Martinique in the Caribbean. He did well in school from a young age. This got him a scholarship to study in Paris, where he went to the Elite École Normale Supérieure and met Léopold Sédar Senghor, an African student and poet who later became the famous first president of Senegal. Césaire started a magazine called L'Étudiant Noir, the Black Student, to give a voice to students from France's overseas colonies and to speak out against the widespread racism he saw in Paris. Senghor and Suzanne Roussy, another student from Martinique who later married Césaire in 1937, both wrote for it. 2 years later, they went back to Martinique, where they both taught at the prestigious Lycée Sculpture, wrote a lot in their free time, and started and ran the important literary magazine Tropiques during World War II. Tropiques was used by the Césaires and the group of intellectuals and friends who gathered around them to promote a Pan-African Marxist theory called Negritude and find out what surrealist techniques could mean for writing and art. Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, Cahier d'un Retour au Pays Natal, Césaire's first major work, brought him world fame around the same time, even though it was first published in 1939. As a teacher, Césaire also helped Frantz Fanon, a doctor and activist, and Édouard Glissant, a literary critic, become two of Martinique's best-known writers. Césaire ran for office in 1945, hoping to help Martinique become independent or get more freedom within the French colonial empire. He was elected mayor of Martinique's capital and biggest city, Fort-de-France. During this time, he wrote a controversial rule that helped Martinique become a department, which is like a state or province, but also made it easier for the French to control the island. He joined the French Communist Party at first, and it was during this time that he wrote Discourse on Colonialism in 1950. Césaire left the Communist Party quickly, though, and in 1958 he started a new party called the Martinican Progressive Party. During the next 50 years, Césaire kept his job as mayor of Fort-de-France and took on other government positions in Martinique and France. He also kept writing plays, essays, and many volumes of poetry. Even after he retired in 2001, he stayed involved in politics. For example, in 2005 he protested a law that said French schools had to teach about the positive values of French colonialism. Césaire died in 2008 of heart failure, but he is still liked and respected in Martinique and all over France.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.